Diamant, birth, and early life in Hierapolis. Close your eyes and imagine the soft limestone terraces of ancient Hierapolis, carved by millennia of mineral-rich waters, cascading down the hillside like frozen waterfalls. The year is 55 CE, and the world feels both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. Steam rises gently from the thermal pools, catching the golden light of dawn as it breaks over the Phrygian countryside. This is where our story begins tonight, not with grand proclamations or dramatic flourishes, but with something much more precious: the quiet arrival of a child who would change how we think about freedom, resilience, and what it truly means to be human. Hierapolis sits like a jewel in the landscape of what we now call Turkey. The name itself means sacred city, and walking through its streets in those early days of the Roman Empire, you can understand why. The air shimmers with warmth from the natural hot springs that bubble up from deep within the earth. White travertine terraces stretch as far as the eye can see, each pool reflecting the endless blue of the Anatolian sky. But it's not just the natural beauty that makes this place special. It's the people, the rhythm of their daily lives, the way they've learned to live in harmony with both the gifts and challenges of their world. Picture the narrow streets in the early morning hours. Merchants are just beginning to set up their stalls, arranging pottery and textiles with the careful precision of those who understand that beauty matters, even in the smallest things. The scent of fresh bread drifts from the bakeries, mixing with the mineral-rich air and the sweet fragrance of wild herbs growing along the hillsides. Children run between the market stalls, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. Women gather at the public fountains, not just to collect water, but to share news, offer comfort, and weave the invisible threads that hold communities together. These are the moments that matter, the quiet acts of care that happen when no one is watching. In one of the modest homes nestled into these hillsides, a child is born. We don't know his birth name. History has kept that secret. What we do know is that this baby, this tiny bundle of possibility, will grow up to become Epictetus, a name that means acquired one. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in this moment, he's simply a newborn taking his first breaths of that warm, mineral-scented air. His mother cradles him gently, perhaps looking out through the small window at those endless white terraces, wondering what kind of life awaits this little one. She couldn't have imagined the journey that lay ahead. None of us can, really. That's one of the first lessons Epictetus will eventually teach us. That life unfolds in ways we never expect, and our power lies not in controlling what happens, but in how we choose to respond. The Hierapolis of his childhood is a place where different worlds intersect. Roman citizens live alongside Greek-speaking locals and slaves from distant lands. Merchants from Syria trade with farmers from the surrounding valleys. Jewish families worship alongside followers of ancient Phrygian deities and newer mystery religions. It's a cosmopolitan place in its own quiet way. Not cosmopolitan like our modern cities with their rushing traffic and glowing screens, but cosmopolitan in the deeper sense, a place where different ways of being human brush up against each other daily, creating something richer and more complex than any single tradition could offer alone. Imagine young Epictetus taking his first steps along those limestone paths. His small hands reach out to steady himself against sun-warmed stone walls. His eyes, bright with curiosity, take in everything. The way water flows endlessly from pool to pool, the patterns light makes as it dances on the surface, the gentle steam that rises like prayers into the clear air. These aren't just pretty details from a distant past. They're the foundation stones of a philosophy that will eventually help millions of people find peace in the midst of chaos. Because Epictetus learns early, simply by living in this place, that some things flow naturally and beautifully when we stop trying to force them into shapes they were never meant to take. Watch him as he grows from toddler to young boy. He helps his family with simple tasks, carrying water from the springs, gathering herbs from the hillsides, learning the names of plants and their uses. His world is small in geographic terms, but infinite in the lessons it offers about patience, observation, and finding wonder in everyday moments. The thermal pools become his classroom in ways no formal school could match. He watches how the water always finds its level, how it flows around obstacles rather than fighting them, how it creates beauty simply by following its nature. These observations will echo through his later teachings about accepting what we cannot change while focusing our energy on what we can. The people of Hierapolis live with a particular kind of wisdom that comes from dwelling in a place of natural abundance. They understand that the earth provides what they need, but only if they pay attention, only if they respect the rhythms and patterns that have sustained life here for countless generations. Young Epictetus absorbs these lessons without even realizing he's learning. He sees how the farmers wait for the right moment to plant, how they read the subtle signs in sky and soil that tell them when to act and when to be patient. He watches his mother and the other women of the community, noting how they support each other through difficulties with a quiet strength that needs no fanfare or recognition. This is where he first encounters the idea that true power comes not from controlling others, but from understanding yourself, your place in the larger web of relationships that sustain all life. It's a lesson that will serve him well in the much harsher circumstances that await him. But for now, in these early years, life unfolds with the gentle rhythm of the seasons. Spring brings wildflowers to the hillsides and the return of migratory birds. Summer means long, warm days and the sweet taste of fruit ripening in the sun. Autumn arrives with harvest celebrations and the satisfaction of work well done. Winter offers time for reflection, for storytelling around warm fires, for the deep rest that prepares the soul for another cycle of growth. As Epictetus grows older, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, he begins to notice things that will shape his understanding of human nature. He sees that some people in Hierapolis live in larger houses, while others make do with very little. He observes that some speak with the confidence of those who expect to be obeyed, while others keep their voices soft and their eyes downcast. These aren't abstract lessons about social hierarchy. They're lived experiences of a child trying to make sense of why the world works the way it does. Why do some people seem to carry themselves as if they own the very air they breathe, while others move through life as if apologizing for taking up space? These questions don't have easy answers, and perhaps that's the point. Epictetus learns early that wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions and being willing to sit with uncertainty while you search for truth. The child who will become one of history's greatest teachers of inner freedom is learning his first lessons about outer bondage. But he's also learning something else, something that will prove even more important in the years to come. He's learning that peace is possible even in imperfect circumstances, that joy can be found even when life doesn't unfold according to our plans, that there's a kind of strength that no external force can touch. As we settle deeper into this ancient world tonight, let yourself feel the warmth of that Phrygian sun on your skin. Let the sound of flowing water calm your mind. Let the image of a curious child exploring limestone terraces remind you that wisdom often begins with wonder, and that some of life's most important lessons come not from books or lectures, but from simply paying attention to the world around us. This is where Epictetus's story begins, in beauty, in simplicity, in the kind of peace that comes from being exactly where you are, when you are. Soon his life will take a dramatic turn that will test everything he's learned in these quiet hills. But that's a story for the next part of our journey together. Enslavement and service to Epaphroditus. And so it was that around the year 68 CE, when Epictetus was perhaps 13 years old, his world changed completely. The boy who had spent his early years wandering the terraced hillsides of Hierapolis, who had learned to read the sky and listen to the wind, suddenly found himself far from home, bound in service to a man named Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus was no ordinary master. He served as secretary to Emperor Nero himself, moving through the corridors of power in Rome with the swift efficiency of someone who understood that his position depended entirely on his usefulness. He was a man who collected things, beautiful objects, rare manuscripts, talented people, and somehow young Epictetus had caught his attention. We don't know exactly how this happened. The historical records from this time are incomplete. What we do know is that Epictetus found himself transported from the mineral springs and peaceful valleys of his childhood into the heart of the Roman Empire. Imagine that journey. A young boy traveling hundreds of miles from everything familiar, watching the landscape change from the white limestone terraces of home to the bustling, overwhelming cityscape of Rome. The Rome of 68 CE was a city of contradictions. Magnificent marble temples stood alongside crowded tenements. The wealthy districts gleamed with polished stone and elaborate gardens, while other neighborhoods echoed with the sounds of commerce, argument, and daily survival. For a boy from the quiet hills of Phrygia, it must have been both fascinating and terrifying. Epaphroditus' household was located in one of the better districts, close enough to the imperial palaces that he could be summoned quickly when needed, but comfortable enough to reflect his status. The house itself would have been built around a central courtyard with rooms opening onto covered walkways. There would have been the constant sound of fountains, the soft splash of water that wealthy Romans used to mask conversations and create an atmosphere of refinement. For Epictetus, this new life meant learning an entirely different set of skills. No longer could he spend his days observing the natural world and pondering its mysteries. Now he had to master the complex social dynamics of a Roman household. He had to learn when to speak and when to remain silent, when to step forward and when to make himself invisible. But here's something remarkable about this young man. Even in circumstances that would have broken many people, Epictetus began to discover something powerful within himself. He realized that while his external circumstances had changed dramatically, something essential about him remained untouched. His capacity for observation, for wonder, for learning. These things belonged to him in a way that no one could take away. In Epaphroditus' household, there were scrolls, lots of them. As secretary to the emperor, Epaphroditus needed access to philosophical works, historical texts, legal documents, and somehow, perhaps because he showed unusual intelligence, or perhaps because Epaphroditus recognized his potential, Epictetus was given access to these treasures. Picture him in the evening hours, when the day's duties were finished. The household would grow quiet except for the gentle splash of the fountain and the occasional murmur of conversation from the master's quarters. Oil lamps would flicker in their niches, casting dancing shadows on the painted walls. And there, in whatever corner he could find, Epictetus would unroll a scroll and begin to read. This is where he first encountered the writings of the great Stoic philosophers, Chrysippus, with his rigorous logic and systematic thinking, Cleanthes, whose Hymn to Zeus spoke of a universe governed by reason and purpose, and most importantly, Epictetus discovered the works of Epictetus the Elder. Wait, that's not right. Let me correct that. He discovered the works of earlier Stoics who would profoundly influence his own thinking. The Stoic philosophy that Epictetus encountered in those scrolls wasn't the cold, emotionless system that many people imagine today. It was actually a deeply practical philosophy of resilience and inner freedom. It taught that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can always control how we respond. that while external circumstances may limit our bodies, nothing can imprison our minds unless we allow it. For a young man in Epictetus's situation, these ideas must have felt like discovering fire. Here was a way of thinking that transformed his circumstances from a tragedy into a kind of training ground. Every difficult moment became an opportunity to practice wisdom. Every challenge became a chance to strengthen his inner resolve. But it wasn't just the philosophical texts that educated him. Living in Epaphroditus' household meant observing power up close, seeing how it operated, how it corrupted, how it created both opportunities and dangers. He watched his master navigate the treacherous currents of imperial favor. He saw how quickly fortunes could change, how the mighty could fall, how external success provided no guarantee of inner peace. Epaphroditus himself was an interesting character, a man who had risen from humble origins to a position of significant influence, yet who remained always aware of how precarious his situation was. He was educated, sophisticated, capable of appreciating both philosophy and poetry, yet he was also ruthless when necessary, understanding that survival in Nero's court required a certain flexibility of conscience. From his master, Epictetus learned lessons that no scroll could teach. He learned to read the subtle signs of mood and intention. He learned when to offer advice and when to simply listen. He learned that intelligence without wisdom could be dangerous, and that wisdom without practical understanding was often useless. The daily rhythms of the household provided their own education. There were visitors to receive, some arriving with urgent messages from the palace, others coming to seek favors or information. There were documents to organize, correspondence to maintain, social obligations to navigate. Through it all, Epictetus moved quietly, observing everything, absorbing lessons about human nature that would later inform his teaching. And gradually, something remarkable began to happen. The boy from Hierapolis began to develop his own philosophical voice. He started to see connections between the Stoic principles he read about and the realities he lived every day. He began to understand that true freedom wasn't about external circumstances at all. It was about the sovereignty of the inner self. This insight didn't come all at once, of course. It developed slowly through countless small moments of choice. When treated unfairly, he could choose resentment or acceptance. When faced with difficult tasks, he could choose complaint or willing engagement. When witnessing injustice, he could choose despair or the determination to live differently. Each choice strengthened something in him, a kind of inner muscle that grew more powerful with use. He was learning, without yet having words for it, what would later become one of his most famous teachings, that we suffer not from the events of our lives, but from our judgments about those events. The household of Epaphroditus became, in effect, Epictetus's first school of philosophy, not because anyone intended it that way, but because he chose to see it that way. He transformed his circumstances through the simple but profound act of paying attention, of looking for wisdom wherever it might be found. And as the months turned into years, as the boy grew into a young man, something extraordinary was taking shape. The future teacher was being forged in the very circumstances that might have destroyed a lesser spirit. The philosopher who would one day teach others about inner freedom was discovering that freedom for himself, not despite his circumstances, but through them. This is the paradox that Epictetus lived and would later teach, that our greatest limitations often become the source of our greatest strengths, that wisdom often emerges not from comfort, but from the creative response to difficulty. Philosophical awakening and growth. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Rome still slept and the household remained still, Epictetus would find himself drawn to contemplation. These were his most precious moments, when the weight of daily tasks lifted and his mind could wander freely through the ideas that increasingly captivated him. He had begun to notice patterns in his thinking, patterns that would one day form the foundation of his teaching. When faced with a difficult task or harsh treatment, he observed his own reactions with the curiosity of a scholar. Why did some events disturb his peace while others barely touched him? What was the difference between the external event and his response to it? The library in Epaphroditus's house became his sanctuary. Among the scrolls of Marcus Aurelius's early writings and the works of earlier Stoic masters, Epictetus discovered a framework for understanding that resonated deeply with his lived experience. The Stoics spoke of a fundamental distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us. This simple division would become the cornerstone of everything he would later teach. But in these early years, it was still taking shape in his mind, still being tested against the reality of his daily life. What was up to him? His judgments about events, his responses to treatment, his choice to see obstacles as opportunities for growth rather than reasons for despair, his decision to cultivate virtue regardless of his circumstances. What was not up to him? The fact of his enslavement, the moods and decisions of others, the political upheavals that swept through Rome, the physical limitations that were beginning to affect his body. As this understanding deepened, something remarkable began to happen. Epictetus found himself experiencing a kind of freedom that had nothing to do with his legal status. When he focused entirely on what was within his control, the things outside his control lost much of their power to disturb him. He began to share these insights with others in the household, fellow slaves who struggled with anger and despair, freedmen who found themselves anxious about their uncertain status, even some of the free-born servants who seemed imprisoned by their own worries and ambitions. "Look," he would say quietly during stolen moments of conversation, "we cannot control what happens to us, but we can always control how we respond to what happens to us. And in that response, that is where our true freedom lives." There was Marcus, an older slave who worked in the kitchens, who had grown bitter over years of servitude. Epictetus would sit with him sometimes, listening to his complaints about the unfairness of their situation. But gradually, he began to offer a different perspective. "Marcus," he would say gently, "your anger is understandable. But notice, your anger changes nothing about your circumstances. It only makes your experience of those circumstances more painful. What if we could find a way to respond that brought you peace instead of torment?" It wasn't that Epictetus dismissed the reality of their situation or suggested they should be grateful for injustice. Rather, he was discovering something profound about the nature of human resilience, about the mind's capacity to remain free even when the body is constrained. His conversations with Julia, a young woman who served in the household's weaving room, revealed another dimension of his developing philosophy. Julia was consumed with worry about her family back in Gaul, family she might never see again. "I cannot stop thinking about them," she would confess. "Are they well? Are they safe? Do they remember me?" Epictetus understood her pain intimately, but he had begun to see how this kind of worry was a form of self-imposed suffering. "Julia," he would say, "your love for your family is beautiful, but your worry, does it help them? Does it change their circumstances? Or does it only steal your peace while leaving their situation unchanged?" Through these conversations, he was learning to articulate what would become one of his central teachings, that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about events. The physical challenges that affected Epictetus during these years, whether from birth, injury, or illness, became another laboratory for his philosophical development. Some sources suggest he walked with difficulty, others that he faced various physical limitations. But rather than seeing these as purely negative circumstances, he began to understand them as opportunities for a different kind of strength. When the body is limited, the mind can discover its true capacity. When external mobility is restricted, internal freedom can flourish. These weren't consoling thoughts or mere philosophical abstractions. They were lived realities that Epictetus was discovering day by day. He began to see that the people around him who seemed most free, those with wealth, status, and physical comfort, were often the most enslaved by their fears, desires, and dependencies. Meanwhile, he was discovering a kind of liberty that no one could take from him. His understanding of virtue was also evolving during this period. The Stoics taught that virtue was the only true good, that wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance were more valuable than any external possessions or circumstances. But Epictetus was learning this not as an abstract principle, but as a practical truth. He observed how the pursuit of external goods, wealth, status, pleasure, approval, led to anxiety, competition, and disappointment. But the cultivation of virtue, the commitment to wisdom, fairness, bravery, and self-discipline, brought a satisfaction that no external circumstance could diminish. In small ways, he began to practice this understanding. When treated unfairly, he chose justice in his response rather than retaliation. When faced with difficult tasks, he approached them with courage rather than complaint. When others around him lost their temper, he practiced the self-discipline of remaining calm. These weren't grand gestures or dramatic moments of heroism. They were quiet choices made in ordinary circumstances. The daily practice of philosophy as a way of life rather than merely as intellectual exercise. He began to understand that philosophy, at its best, was not about winning arguments or impressing others with clever insights. It was about living well, about developing the kind of character that could remain steady regardless of external storms. The other slaves and servants began to notice something different about Epictetus. There was a quality of calm about him, not the dullness of resignation, but the alertness of someone who had found solid ground to stand on. People sought him out for conversation, drawn by something they couldn't quite name but instinctively recognized. During this period, Epictetus also began to develop his understanding of the interconnectedness of all things, an insight that would later inform his teaching about our relationships with others. He saw how everyone in the household, from the highest-ranking freedman to the newest slave, was playing a role in a larger drama. Some people were content with their roles, others chafed against them. But Epictetus began to see that peace came not from having the role we might prefer, but from playing whatever role we had been given with excellence and grace. We are like actors in a play, he would reflect. We don't choose our parts, but we can choose how well we perform them. And the measure of a good performance is not whether we have the leading role, but whether we bring integrity and skill to whatever role is ours. This insight brought him a deep sense of purpose. His role might be that of a slave, but he could play that role with dignity, wisdom, and virtue. And in doing so, he was discovering he was more free than many who held positions of apparent power and privilege. As these philosophical insights deepened and matured, Epictetus began to sense that his understanding had a purpose beyond his own peace of mind. The clarity he was gaining, the freedom he was experiencing, these were gifts that could be shared. He didn't yet know that he would one day teach in his own school, that his words would be recorded and preserved, that his insights would guide seekers for centuries to come. But he was beginning to feel the teacher stirring within him, the desire to help others discover the same inner liberty that was transforming his own experience. The slave was becoming a philosopher, and the philosopher was preparing, though he didn't yet know it, to become a teacher whose influence would extend far beyond the walls of any Roman household into the hearts and minds of all who would seek the kind of freedom that no external power can grant or take away. Exile to Nicopolis and establishment of his school, that transformation would soon be tested in ways Epictetus could never have anticipated. For in the 13th year of Emperor Domitian's reign, around the year 93 CE, a decree swept through Rome that would change the course of his life forever. The emperor had grown suspicious of philosophers. Perhaps their teachings of inner freedom seemed too dangerous to a ruler who demanded absolute obedience. Perhaps their emphasis on virtue over power threatened the very foundations of imperial authority. Whatever his reasons, Domitian issued an edict that sent shockwaves through the intellectual circles of Rome. All philosophers were to be banished from the city. Imagine receiving such news. After decades of building a life, of forming connections, of establishing yourself as a teacher and guide, suddenly you must leave everything behind. For many, this would have been a catastrophe, a crushing blow that shattered carefully laid plans and destroyed years of work. But Epictetus had spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Though he may not have realized it at the time, he had learned in the deepest chambers of his heart that true security never comes from external circumstances, that peace cannot be found in any particular place or position, that the only possession that truly matters is the one that travels with you wherever you go. Your capacity to choose your response to whatever life presents. So when the decree came, Epictetus simply gathered his few belongings and prepared to leave Rome, not with bitterness or resentment, but with the quiet acceptance of someone who had long ago learned to distinguish between what was within his control and what was not. The destination he chose speaks volumes about the man he had become. Rather than seeking another great city where he might rebuild his reputation, rather than looking for wealthy patrons who could restore his former comfort, Epictetus turned his steps toward a place that offered something far more precious: peace. Nicopolis lay in the region of Epirus, in what is now northwestern Greece, built by Augustus Caesar to commemorate his victory at the nearby Battle of Actium. It was a city that understood both triumph and transition, a place where the old world had given way to the new, where empires had risen and shifted, where the only constant was change itself. The journey from Rome would have taken many days, walking the ancient roads that connected the empire, passing through landscapes that had witnessed countless other exiles, migrations, and new beginnings, each step carrying Epictetus further from the life he had known and closer to the life he was meant to live. As the familiar hills of Rome faded behind him, as the road stretched endlessly ahead, did he feel afraid? Did doubts creep in during those long nights under unfamiliar stars? We can only imagine, but we know that whatever fears arose, they did not turn him back. For Epictetus carried with him something more valuable than any material possession. He carried a philosophy that had been tested in the crucible of slavery, refined through years of teaching, and proven capable of transforming even the most difficult circumstances into opportunities for growth. When he finally arrived in Nicopolis, dusty and travel-worn, he might have appeared to be just another exile seeking refuge. But appearances, as he had long taught, can be deeply misleading. The city that welcomed him was unlike the bustling, crowded streets of Rome. Nicopolis moved at a different pace. Here, there was space to breathe, time to think, room for the kind of deep conversations that nurture wisdom rather than merely displaying it. Epictetus found modest lodgings and began, quietly, to rebuild his life. But this rebuilding looked nothing like what most people would expect. He didn't seek to recreate what he had lost. Instead, he began to create something entirely new. Word of his presence spread slowly at first. A few curious locals, some traveling merchants who had heard rumors of a wise teacher, young men from wealthy families who had been sent to study rhetoric and found themselves drawn to something deeper. They came expecting lectures on abstract philosophical principles. What they found instead was a man who spoke about the most practical matters imaginable: how to face disappointment without being crushed by it, how to maintain dignity in the face of insult, how to find joy that didn't depend on external circumstances. His teaching method was unlike anything they had encountered. Rather than standing at a distance, delivering polished speeches, Epictetus engaged his students in conversation. He asked questions that made them examine their own assumptions. He challenged them to apply philosophical principles to their daily struggles. "What disturbs you?" he would ask, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a genuine inquiry into the student's actual experience. When they answered, describing their fears about money, their anxiety about reputation, their anger at unfair treatment, Epictetus would guide them gently toward a deeper understanding. Is this thing that troubles you within your control or outside of it? Such a simple question, yet it had the power to transform everything. As the months passed, the little gathering in Nicopolis began to grow. Students arrived not just from Greece, but from across the Roman world. They came seeking the kind of education that promised not just knowledge, but transformation. What they found was a school unlike any other, not a grand institution with marble columns and formal ceremonies, but a community of seekers gathered around a man who had learned to find freedom in the most unlikely places. The daily rhythm of study was gentle, but profound. Morning discussions that began with practical problems and led to timeless insights. Afternoon reflections on the nature of virtue and happiness. Evening conversations that often continued long into the night. As students discovered that philosophy was not an academic exercise, but a way of life, Epictetus himself seemed to flourish in this environment. Away from the political pressures and social complexities of Rome, he could focus entirely on what mattered most to him: teaching, guiding, helping others discover their own capacity for wisdom and resilience. The exile that might have broken another man had become, for Epictetus, a kind of liberation. In losing everything external, he had found everything essential. His reputation began to spread beyond Nicopolis. Visitors would make special journeys just to hear him speak. Letters arrived from former students who had returned to their home cities, carrying his teachings with them like seeds that would eventually bloom in distant soil. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this period was how naturally it all unfolded. There was no forcing, no striving to build an empire of influence. Epictetus simply lived according to his principles, taught what he had learned, and trusted that wisdom, like water, would find its own level. In the quiet streets of Nicopolis, in the gentle rhythm of teaching and learning, in the daily practice of applying philosophy to real life, Epictetus had found something that no emperor could grant and no decree could take away. He had found his true calling, and in finding it, he had created a legacy that would outlast empires. A school of thought that would continue to offer guidance and comfort to seekers for centuries to come. The slave had become a teacher, the exile had become a founder, and the man who had lost everything according to the world's standards had gained something infinitely more precious: the knowledge that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we have become. Teaching and the development of the Enchiridion. Among the olive groves of Nicopolis, where the morning light filtered through ancient leaves, Epictetus had discovered something remarkable. Teaching was not simply about sharing knowledge, it was about transformation, his own, and that of every soul who found their way to his simple school. Word had spread throughout the Roman world about the former slave who spoke with such clarity about freedom. Students arrived from Athens and Alexandria, from distant provinces and wealthy Roman households. They came seeking answers to questions that kept them awake at night, questions about purpose and peace, about how to live well in an uncertain world. Among these seekers was a young Roman named Arrian. Flavius Arrianus had been born to privilege, educated in rhetoric and philosophy, destined for a career in politics and military service. But something in Epictetus's teachings called to him, something that all his formal education had failed to provide. "Master," Arrian said one afternoon as they walked along the terraced paths of the school, "your words, they have a way of staying with us long after the lesson ends. But I worry, when we leave here, when we return to our lives, how much will we remember? How much will we lose?" Epictetus paused, his weathered hands resting on his walking stick. The years had been kind to him in Nicopolis. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter as much as hardship, of wisdom earned through both suffering and joy. "Tell me, Arrian," he said gently, "when you learned to write as a child, did you fear you would forget how to form the letters?" "No, master. Once learned, it became natural." "And so it is with philosophy." Epictetus smiled. "But perhaps there is wisdom in your concern. These teachings, they should not live only in memory. They should be written down, preserved, shared with those who cannot make the journey to Nicopolis." And so began one of history's most beautiful collaborations between teacher and student, between wisdom and preservation. Arrian began to record not just the formal lectures, but the casual conversations, the gentle corrections, the moments of insight that arose naturally in daily life. "Remember," Epictetus would say, as Arrian's stylus moved across the wax tablet, "we are not creating something new. We are simply putting into words what every human heart already knows, that we are more resilient than we believe, more capable of peace than we imagine." The teachings that emerged, first in the detailed discourses and later in the concise handbook known as the Enchiridion, were revolutionary in their simplicity. Here was philosophy stripped of academic pretension, wisdom made accessible to anyone who could read or anyone who could listen. "Some things are within our power," Epictetus taught, "while others are not. It was the foundation of everything, the bedrock upon which all peace could be built. Within our power are our opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, property, reputation, position, and whatever is not of our own doing." Arrian watched students' faces transform as they grasped this simple distinction. A merchant worried about his ships until he realized he could control his preparation and decisions, but not the storms. A mother anxious about her children's futures until she understood she could offer love and guidance, but not guarantees. "You see," Epictetus would explain, his voice always patient, always kind, "we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about events. The same rain that ruins one person's picnic waters another person's garden. The difference lies not in the rain, but in our relationship to what we cannot control." These were not abstract philosophical concepts. They were tools for daily living. When a student spoke of anger toward a difficult neighbor, Epictetus would guide them to see that the neighbor's behavior was outside their control, but their response was entirely their own choice. "Remember," he would say, "no one can hurt you without your permission. People can speak harsh words, they can act unjustly, they can even harm your body, but your inner peace, your essential self, that remains untouchable unless you hand over the key." As the seasons turned in Nicopolis, as young students became mature adults and returned to their lives throughout the empire, the school became something more than a place of learning. It became a living example of stoic principles in action. Epictetus taught not through grand gestures, but through countless small demonstrations. When a student broke a treasured cup, he would say gently, "See, this is what cups do. They break, Were you loving the cup, or loving the idea that it would never change? When news arrived of political upheaval in Rome, of emperors rising and falling, he would remind his students that empires are temporary, but virtue is eternal. We cannot control the actions of rulers, he would say, but we can control whether we remain just, whether we continue to act with integrity, whether we choose courage over fear. Arrian captured it all, the profound and the practical, the philosophical frameworks and the gentle humor. He recorded how Epictetus taught students to examine their desires, not to eliminate them, but to hold them lightly. Want what happens, the master would say, and you will be happy. It seemed almost too simple, until students began to practice it. The traveler who accepted delays without frustration, the parent who loved their child without trying to control their choices, the citizen who worked for justice without attachment to specific outcomes. They discovered a freedom that no external circumstance could touch. This is what we mean by living according to nature, Epictetus would explain. Not the nature of wild animals, but human nature at its best. We are rational beings, capable of choice, designed for virtue and community. When we align our will with reality, when we accept what is while working toward what should be, we find peace. The Enchiridion, the little handbook that Arrian compiled from these teachings, would eventually travel far beyond Nicopolis. It would be copied by monks, studied by emperors, treasured by ordinary people seeking extraordinary wisdom. But here, in these golden afternoons of teaching and learning, Epictetus was simply doing what he had always done, taking what life offered and transforming it into something beautiful. The harsh experiences of slavery had become compassion for others' struggles. The pain of exile had become appreciation for simple pleasures. The limitation of physical disability had become unlimited inner freedom. You see, he told Arrian as they watched the sun set over the Adriatic, every difficulty carries within it the seeds of wisdom. Every challenge is an opportunity to practice what we teach. This is not philosophy. This is life itself. Legacy and reflections on inner peace. The years flowed like the gentle tides that lapped against Nicopolis's shores, and with each passing season, Epictetus's wisdom deepened like wine, aging in ancient amphora. His students came and went, carrying his teachings across the Mediterranean world, but the man himself remained constant as the North Star, anchored in that unshakable peace he had discovered so long ago in the marble quarries of his youth. As his hair silvered and his face lined with the maps of countless conversations, Epictetus would often sit in the evening garden of his school, watching the olive trees sway in the coastal breeze, the same breeze that had once carried him from slavery to freedom, from Rome to this place of sanctuary, from suffering to understanding. And in those quiet moments, surrounded by the gentle sounds of students discussing philosophy in the courtyard, he could feel the profound satisfaction of a life lived in accordance with nature. "Tell me, teacher," a young woman asked one evening, her voice soft with the vulnerability that comes just before sleep, "how do we know, how do we truly know that we have found peace?" Epictetus smiled, his eyes reflecting the last golden light of sunset. "Peace, dear one, is not something we find. It is something we uncover, like archaeologists brushing away centuries of dust to reveal the treasure that was always there." His voice carried the weight of decades, the gentleness of hard-won wisdom. "You will know you have found it when the storms of life no longer shake your foundation, when you can watch your thoughts like clouds passing across the sky, neither grasping at the beautiful ones nor pushing away the dark ones." The student nodded, her eyelids growing heavy as the day's tensions began to dissolve. Around them, the school settled into its evening rhythm. the soft murmur of final conversations, the distant sound of waves against the shore, the gentle rustle of papyrus scrolls being carefully stored away. This was the legacy Epictetus treasured most, not the fame that had spread his name across the empire, but these quiet moments of transmission, wisdom passing from one weary soul to another like a flame shared in darkness. Remember, he continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, that everything you need for happiness, everything you need for peace, already exists within you. The external world, with all its demands and expectations, with all its noise and urgency, can never give you what you already possess, nor can it take away what is truly yours. As the months turned to years, Epictetus watched his students graduate not just from his school, but from the need for external validation. They learned to find their worth not in others' opinions, but in the quiet dignity of living according to their values. They discovered that true strength was not the absence of struggle, but the ability to remain centered within it, like trees that grow stronger with each storm. They developed roots that reach deep into the bedrock of stoic wisdom. One particularly gifted student, a young mother who had traveled from distant Gaul, once asked him about the burden of caring for others. "Master," she said, exhaustion evident in every word, "I give and give until I have nothing left. How do I care for my family, for my community, without losing myself in the process?" Epictetus leaned forward, his eyes bright with understanding. "Ah, beloved student, you speak of one of life's greatest challenges, but consider this." He gestured toward the fountain in the center of the courtyard, water flowing endlessly from its source. The fountain gives constantly, yet it is never empty. Why? Because it is connected to a source deeper than itself. When you try to give from your own reserves, you will indeed run dry. But when you connect to the infinite well of virtue within you, to the source of love and wisdom that flows through all things, then your giving becomes effortless, natural, sustainable. The woman's shoulders visibly relaxed as she absorbed these words. Around the courtyard, other students paused in their conversations, drawn by the timeless wisdom that seemed to speak directly to their own struggles. This was the magic of Epictetus's teaching, the way ancient truths could illuminate modern pain with the gentle light of understanding. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above Nicopolis, Epictetus would often reflect on the strange journey that had brought him to this place, from the mineral springs of Hierapolis to the marble halls of Rome, from the chains of slavery to the freedom of philosophical inquiry. Every step had been necessary. Every hardship had carved away something false, revealing more of the truth beneath. "We are like sculptors," he told his evening students, his voice soft as silk. "But instead of working with marble, we work with our own souls. Each challenge, each moment of choosing virtue over vice, each decision to respond with wisdom rather than react with emotion. These are the chisel strikes that reveal the masterpiece hidden within." The night air carried the scent of jasmine and sea salt, and in that perfect moment, surrounded by seekers of wisdom under the canopy of stars, Epictetus felt the profound contentment that comes from a life aligned with purpose. Not the restless satisfaction of achievement, but the deep peace of acceptance, the joy of knowing that he had transformed his suffering into service, his pain into compassion, his limitations into liberation. Years later, when scholars would debate the finer points of stoic philosophy, when emperors would quote his teachings and common people would find comfort in his words, they would marvel at how a slave from a small city in Asia Minor had managed to capture the essence of human flourishing. But those who knew him understood that his wisdom came not from books or theories, but from the patient practice of living each day according to his principles. The test of philosophy, he often said, is not how eloquently we can speak about virtue, but how gracefully we can embody it when life tests us. Anyone can be wise in the sunshine, but true wisdom reveals itself in the storm. And what storms he had weathered! The physical pain that never fully left his body, the social rejection that came with his status, the professional setbacks and personal losses that mark every human life. Yet through it all, he had maintained that inner citadel of peace, that unassailable fortress of the spirit that no external force could breach. Now, as the gentle darkness of evening settles around us like a soft blanket, we can feel the presence of that ancient wisdom still alive in the world, in every person who chooses kindness over cruelty, in every soul who finds strength in acceptance rather than resistance, in every heart that discovers joy in simple pleasures rather than endless striving. The spirit of Epictetus lives on. His teachings echo across the centuries like ripples spreading across still water, touching lives he could never have imagined, bringing comfort to the tired, strength to the weary, hope to those who feel lost in the complexity of modern existence. The woman listening to these words as she prepares for sleep, she carries within her the same capacity for wisdom and peace that Epictetus discovered in himself all those centuries ago. Let yourself sink deeper into the softness of this moment, feeling the weight of the day dissolving like salt in warm water, your shoulders releasing their burden, your mind quieting its endless chatter, your heart opening to the possibility of rest. This is what Epictetus knew. That peace is not a destination we must reach, but a return to what we have always been beneath the layers of worry and striving. Feel yourself connected to that long line of seekers, stretching back through the centuries to that lamp-lit school in Nicopolis, where a former slave taught the children of emperors that true nobility comes not from birth or wealth, but from the cultivation of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. You are part of that legacy now, a carrier of that flame, a guardian of that precious understanding. As sleep approaches like a gentle tide, let Epictetus's final teaching wash over you with the tenderness of a mother's lullaby. You are not your circumstances, his voice whispers across time. You are not your mistakes or your achievements, your successes or your failures. You are the awareness that witnesses all of these, the consciousness that chooses how to respond, the eternal spark that connects you to the divine reason that governs all things. Rest now in that knowing, in the profound peace that comes from understanding your true nature, in the gentle acceptance that allows life to be exactly as it is, while you remain centered in who you are. And let the wisdom of ages carry you softly into dreams, where ancient fountains flow endlessly under starlit skies, where olive trees whisper secrets of resilience and grace, where the eternal teachings of a humble philosopher continue to heal and transform every soul they touch, including yours, especially yours, as you drift now into the boundless peace that has always been your birthright, your home, your deepest truth.